This is Watercolor Lesson 9, Learning to Exercise Restraint. Learning to recognize, sorry. Okay, let me start. This is Watercolor Lesson 9, Learning to Exercise Restraint. Learning to exercise restraint. How do I know when to stop? Knowing when to stand back from your painting involves skills that have very little to do with technical prowess. While finesse and a steady hand are required to paint the fine branches of a winter tree, it takes something else entirely to know enough not to try to include them all. Considering our common tendency to overload our paintings and to become unnecessarily specific, a kind of restraint is what is really needed. Our attempts to anticipate and overcome our bad habits can be strengthened by taking a broader view of the work in progress. The detachment that lets you keep an eye on the big picture is a habit that can be learned. Just remember to ask, what role does the part I'm about to paint play in the big picture? This will keep you from being prematurely drawn into specifics. Everywhere your eye goes, the painting is in similar focus, making it difficult to know where to linger. The patches of foliage in the background insist on coming forward. Too many hard edges distract the viewer's attention. It might help to connect some of the darks, reducing the number of shapes. Here's an example of an image for which this important question was not asked. There are warning signs that should tell you when you're approaching a good place to stop, or at least to pause and stand back. Recognizing this moment may be the most important watercolor skill of all. The signs are not the same for everyone, since each of us has a different sense of how much information is enough, but the process of identifying the red flags should work for anyone. The first step is to find the patterns in your practice. Do you tend to begin overpainting at a particular stage of your paintings? Chances are the first couple of layers are general enough that you stay out of trouble there. But many painters are seduced by the power of the small dark strokes that make up the final layer. It's exciting to see how much meaning these strokes can bring to the lights and mid-values. And it's easy to assume that more of them will provide more meaning. But part of the impact of the small darks comes from their scarcity. Even one too many makes all the rest feel too obvious. Better to err on the side of too little information than too much. The layer of darks, just 5 or 6 strokes in the foreground tree, provides all the information needed to describe the atmosphere in this scene. Even one dark stroke in any of the background trees would have been a mistake. The rocks at the bottom of this painting could have benefited from fewer strokes. I knew the foreground rocks were going to be tricky, but rather than do a study or two, I launched right into the painting, saving the rocks for last. When the first few strokes began to define the rocks nicely, I got carried away and made lots of them. If you can identify a stage of your paintings when you make more strokes than necessary, you know when to turn on the restraint. In my work, I become wary as soon as the subject suggests many small strokes. A history of overpainting has led me to wait and look for a simpler way to symbolize the complex subject. In this painting, the single stroke of the mountain provides an engaging contrast to the jumble of individual shapes below. The complexity of the foreground in this view from the roof seemed likely to get me bogged down in specifics. I let go of accuracy in favor of an interpretation based on generalization. It's helpful to take an analytical look at paintings you admire to see how many layers are involved. See if you can tell what was done first, then next, and next again. You may be surprised to find that it seldom takes more than 4 or 5 layers to reach a very convincing density and light. Many of John Singer Sargent's seemingly detailed images are made up of only 3 layers. Much of his complex and beautifully fluid water is realized with only a first layer of vertical washes crossed by a second of horizontal strokes. What appears at first to be dazzling brushwork turns out to be the result of remarkable awareness. Sargent knew that 2 simple layers would be enough to realize the complexity of the water in the harbor. There's nothing especially difficult about the execution of either the washes or the strokes. The real accomplishment was his vision. There will, of course, be some subjects that refuse to resolve into a simple series of layers. However, as a general approach to simplifying your painting process, it's an effective place to start. Identifying individual layers. To see the first layer as it underlines the later, darker, and more specific ones, it's necessary to look past the darks and mid-values. This is a kind of selective vision that takes practice. Before you begin painting, ask yourself, what will the individual layers look like? In this painting, the entire middle ground started out as a light orange wash. As a second layer, a pattern of slightly darker horizontal orange stripes was applied. Then the darker blue shadows were laid on top of those. The butte in the foreground similarly involved 3 layers that progress from light to dark. Each of the major shapes in this painting has only 2 or 3 layers. In the topmost shape, layer 1 was a pale violet rectangle. The purple wash of the mountain was the second layer, and that's all there is. Does the snowy part of the mountain look light to you? That's partly because calling it snow creates the expectation of whiteness. To avoid getting painted into a corner, watercolor painters need to develop the skill of seeing a couple of layers ahead of themselves. I often feel a sense of despair after 1 or 2 layers has been applied. As with this image, at this stage the painting looks completely hopeless. Do not give up on a picture until you've put in the darkest darks. It may in fact turn out to be a failure, but you cannot be sure if those powerful darks are not there yet. Try picturing the darkest darks from the photo below as a separate image. It helps to squint. Okay, so identify the darkest dark. Staring at the top of this photograph, the wires would all be part of the darkest layer, along with the vertical poles, the eaves and the windows of the buildings. On the left, the cast shadows of those buildings, the underside of the purple bougainvillea. I have no idea if I said that correctly. What else? Now visualize the darkest darks in isolation. Exaggerating the contrast of the photograph isolates the darkest darks. When subtle values are rounded up or down, only black and white remain. Once you visualize the darkest darks in the colored photo, check the image in your mind's eye against the image on the right. Without the light and mid-value forms, the darkest layer would look like this. Are there any surprises? If the layers of the original photograph were printed on transparencies, this layer, the darkest darks, could literally be peeled back to reveal the middle values and lights beneath. Instead, we look at the photo, when we look at the photo or the actual scene, we do the peeling mentally. Working backward, imagine the scene without the darkest darks, then with the medium darks removed, and then the dark mid values, okay? And finally, the lighter mid values, until nothing is left but the white paper. Evaluating the layers. So how much care does each layer require? With a high contrast image like the Oaxaca, when we see the dark separated from the other values, it's clear that they do most of the work of establishing the illusion of reality. The cast shadows reveal the strong light, while the obvious perspective of the buildings defines a clear feeling of space. Alas, we cannot always depend on the darkest darks to pull our paintings together. Some images are chosen specifically for the subtlety of the light and mid-value forms, and the darks cannot be counted on to make the picture cohere. Others seem so complicated we cannot easily discern the role the darks will play. In these cases, it may be necessary to begin taking care earlier in the progression of layers. Recognizing in advance the point at which shapes need to be defined can be tricky. Get in the habit of assessing the effectiveness of the illusions you seek as the painting develops, layer by layer. Eventually, you will know before the painting begins what role the lights, mid-values, and darks play in creating a feeling of space or light or substance, and this will inform the degree of care you take at each stage. Looking back at the following images will help make this point obvious. So apply the light and mid-values. I've deliberately painted outside the lines to see if it's true that the darks have enough narrative clarity to make sense of this mess. If it works, it means that when I'm layering down the first 2 layers, I need not be distracted by detail, and all of my attention can be devoted to simply making gorgeous, juicy paint. Now apply the darks carefully. This is a good example of the benefit of asking what needs to be true in the finished painting. Being a little careful with the darks allowed me to be carefree with everything else. In this scene, subtle texture and color play a bigger role than in the Oaxaca one. The middle values and the lights tell more of the story than the darkest darks. Consequently, more care must be taken in the first layers. Some of the edges between shapes need to be established right away rather than waiting till the darks go down. So this detail of Homestead shows where the roof, tree, and background come together. Notice there are no bold darks to define the separate shapes. The final form of each had to be established with the very first layer. Looking at the images and scenes as potential paintings is partly a process of remembering in terms of form what has worked before. We each develop a repertoire of successes that informs the choices we make and encourages us to keep expanding our range. For example, enough experience seeing the role the darks play in creating a sense of substance gives us the confidence to take on a new subject. We acquire the faith that what worked in a sunlit street scene in Manhattan will also work in a slot canyon in southern Utah. Can you picture the most of this sketch was made with 2 layers. There's still some sense of light, space, and substance though. Can you picture the first layer by itself? At which stage did the illusion of light appear? And how about space? If you can't answer these questions, I do suggest going back over what I already told you to make sure that you are where you're supposed to be right now. Can you picture the first layer by itself? At what stage did the illusion of light appear? And how about the space? Okay. And this study is basically a 3-value treatment of a particular quality of light in which each value has its own layer. Which layer provides the space and substance? Which layer provides the light? So for your assignment, you're going to evaluate layers. So you're going to create a watercolor painting in which you're carefree and go outside the lines with the first layers. And then you're going to use your darks to define the subject matter like I did in this painting here.